very happy to be co-sponsoring this event with Axel Bertelsen. And this event is featuring speakers from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources on permitting of frac sand mining in the state of Wisconsin. Whether you are here contemplating applying for permits, or if you've already obtained permits, I think the information you'll receive from the presenters today are going to be invaluable to you. Additionally, for those municipalities that are here, I think the information you'll receive will lead to a better discussion at the local level between you, your supervising boards, and the concerned citizens in your municipalities. So welcome to everyone. What we'd like to do is start this off by, if there's any municipal representatives here, if they could please stand, and we'd like to go through and just have you identify yourself by name and which municipality you represent. That way, if there's anybody here that wants to engage in any type of discussion with you regarding what's going on in your municipality, they'd be able to do that. So let's start on the left-hand side here. Is there any municipal representatives here?
I'm Tina Sass, the city administrator for the city of Whitehall.
So that was Tina Sass from Whitehall. Thanks, Tina.
I'm Ryan Radke, the Corporation Council of Trumbull County. Kate Woodish, Environmental Specialist, Trumbull County. Keith McCollum, Zoning Environmental Specialist, Trumbull County.
So that's Trumbull County that is present.
David Gifford, Barron County Zoning Administrator.
Tracy Peterson, Barron County Soil and Water Conservation Department.
Representatives from Barron County.
Dan Peterson, Eau Claire City County Health Department.
Heather Bolton, Eau Claire County Assistant Corporation Council.
Rod Esslinger, Land Use Supervisor, Eau Claire County.
So we have the city of Eau Claire and the county of Eau Claire represented here. Anyone on the right here? Oh,
Peter Stoltman, Buffalo County Zoning.
Buffalo County.
Julie Lindstrom, Buffalo County.
Northwest Buffalo County.
Any other municipal representatives?
Mueller Olson, Jackson County Land Conservation Department. Kerry Schmidt, Jackson County Zoning.
It's Jackson County,
Brad Roy, Pierce County Zoning.
Pierce County,
And I'm Doris Down, person from the city of Whitehall.
and the city of Whitehall. I'll also add that I am Jackson County Corporation Counsel. For those of you that are attorneys in attendance, there is a sign-up sheet because there will be continuing legal education credits that will be available. If you're an engineer, you do not need to sign up. However, there will be credits available from this event. So with that, I will go to our first speaker. And the way we're going to go about this is we'll have topic discussions according to the agenda. If there is time at the conclusion of their presentation, they will take questions. Otherwise, we will have questions and an open discussion at the conclusion of the presentations. So the first presentation is by Jeff Johnson from the Wisconsin DNR on air management permitting. Jeff.
Everybody hear me okay? All right. Good morning. I'm Jeff Johnson. I am the DNR's West Central Region Air Management Team Supervisor. I have been with the DNR for almost 13 years. I have been an air permit writer for about 8 of those years and then the supervisor for the rest. Today I have quite a bit to go through, and then I will have to leave immediately after I'm done at 10. But I do have my contact information on all these presentations, so if you have questions, ask while I'm going through, or else feel free to email or call me. I have 3 presentations to go through. The first one, we're going to look at air pollution control permitting. The other 2 will be about monitoring and then compliance with the permits. So for permits, we're going to talk about exemptions, general registration permits, and then the more traditional permits. We'll take a look at the permit process itself, mainly for traditional permits. Talk a little bit about the single source support facility issue. Some of you may be well aware of that. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the next two presentations on monitoring and compliance demonstration. For exemptions, there are a lot of possibilities for being exempt from an air permit. For those that aren't aware, we have two portions to our permit program. We have the construction permit phase and the operation permit phase. For construction permits, you're looking at our chapters NR 405 and 406. I'm not going to talk too much on 405. That is for major PSD sources. We have yet to have a industrial sand mine reach that level. It's unlikely to see that coming, although I suppose it could. But that chapter is also very complicated. And if we ever get to that point, feel free to get in touch with us right away, because that can be very difficult to navigate. But for the majority, NR 406 is where we're going to be focusing. That's what we call our minor NSR program. Second part is operation permits. That's under chapter NR 407. As we go through some of the examples of exemptions, just wanted to point out that typically for brand new sources, what we call greenfield sources, that is companies that construct their entire facility all at once and it's brand new at a new site. Typically, when you find yourself to be exempt from a construction permit, you'll almost always be exempt from an operation permit as well. The exemptions are pretty much identical between 406 and 407. For 406, construction permits, there's 3 subsections in here for exemptions. The first one talks about specific exemptions. As the title indicates, they are exemptions that are specific to a process unit, a type of industry. So they're all very specific. I've pulled out just a couple that relate to this industry. For example, the first one, industrial sand mines with actual production less than 2,000 tons per month on an actual 12-month average. Fixed sand and gravel plants or portable sand and gravel plants with those types of capacities. The last one there is probably worth noting. Those of you that have an operation permit, have been in operation, there's also an exemption when you want to add in or replace equipment at your site, such as a bucket elevator or a conveyor. Something to note on these, if you find yourself exempt under any one of these, you're done. You don't have to find another exemption. If you don't qualify for one but do qualify for another, it doesn't matter. You just need to qualify for one exemption and you're done. The second part under the construction permit exemptions is the controlled actual emission exemption, otherwise what we refer to as the 10-ton per year exemption. This one is not specific. It's open to any project, any facility, any modification. It's based on the 1666 pounds per month, 12-month average, or 10 tons per year. That's what it equates to. And there's some other criteria in there that you need to be aware of, that you can't be subject to what we call a backed or layered determination under our hazardous air pollutant chapter. You also can't be subject to a new source performance standard or a federal MAC standard. I'll hit on this a little bit more. For this exemption, there is an actual application and fee required for us to process that. But that one is also available. The final subcategory for exemptions would be the general exemption. And once again, this one applies to any project. It's not specific. The difference here is the pollutant thresholds are based on maximum theoretical emissions. Okay? Each pollutant has a different threshold. And again, you have those two little factors there. It can't be subject to a backed layer under 445 or a federal NSPS or MAC standard. For operation permits, as I mentioned, for an entire new source, typically if you are exempt from construction permitting, you will be exempt from operation permits. The exemptions are the same. The difference here is when you have an existing source. Being exempt under 406 may not necessarily mean you qualify for an exemption under 407. In most cases, sources that are operating, have an existing operating permit, when you want to make a modification or change, you may find yourself having that project be exempt under 406, but not under 407, because under 407 you need to consider your entire facility that's already in existence. Typically in those cases, it's a matter of updating your operation permit as a revision application. And you want to know, it's very important that for those exempt changes, you will be required to submit an application to revise that permit prior to commencing construction. So let's hit on some of the responsibilities if you find that you're exempt. You should note that in most cases the application for an exemption is not required. If your firm or your consultants determine that you're exempt from permitting, all you need to do is maintain the documentation to demonstrate your continuous exempt status. You do not need to submit an exemption request or a fee. You can retain all that yourself. However, you can always request the DNR determination on that project. We'd be more than happy to review it. However, there is a fee for that. At this point, we no longer provide exemption determinations by email or over the phone. If you actually want something from us in writing, we do need the application in hand along with the fee. As I mentioned, you do need to ensure you maintain proper documentation of your exempt status. If that status ever changes, you exceed that exemption threshold, you no longer qualify for the exemption no matter what happens after that point. You could hit that bump, business is going good, you go over the exemption threshold, and then a month later it falls off and you're back under the exemption threshold. Doesn't matter. Once you trip that threshold, you need to be covered by a permit. So you'll need to get that application in right away. As we'll go through a little bit later here, one thing to point out, even though you're exempt from a permit, you are not exempt from regulation. There still may be many different emission limitations, control requirements that you will have to meet even though you don't need to be covered by a permit. So moving on to actual permits. First one I'm going to talk about is general permits. Some of you may have these in hand already. It's a very easy process. The general permit covers very specific categories of sources. We have them both as a general construction and a general operation permit. The permit itself has already been issued. All you are doing is applying for coverage under that permit. So there is no public comment period, there's no review. It's just a simple matter of applying for coverage under that permit. It's typically a 15-day review and you're issued that coverage. The three categories of sources that we have general permits for include the ones I have listed there. For the majority of this industry, the first one, rock crushing plants, may be the most familiar to you. That's the one you may want to look at. Registration permits, pretty much the same, with a little bit of difference. These permits are not source specific. Registration permits are available to anyone. Again, they're available for both construction and operation. Again, the permit's already been issued. You're just applying for coverage under that permit. The ROP permit that we have available today covers sources up to 25% of a major source threshold. And that's why we have the 25 ton per year threshold for criteria pollutants, the 2.5 or 6.5 for federal HAPs. It's limiting your source to less than 25% of that major source threshold. Again, the decision is a pretty quick one. Usually get it turned around within 15 days. And we do have the process completely online. So if you don't qualify for an exemption, you can't qualify for a general permit or registration permit. Then last, what we'll just call a traditional permit is what you're going to need. For traditional permits, regardless of what you end up applying for, checking on the box, every time a permit application comes in, we do consider it for both the construction and operation permit, FYI. This process can take 3 months or longer. There's several reasons for that. First one is getting that complete application in. In my experience, I have never seen a complete application submitted yet. There's usually some piece of information missing, clarification needed on what has been submitted. So it's always worthwhile to get that application in way ahead of your schedule, whatever your plans may be, so that we can work with you to get that application complete and reviewed. Also during the period, we have a public comment period that we are required to hold. It's a 30-day period. So there's 1 month already. And then public hearings, and I'll touch on that in just a little bit. That can also cause some delays. The difference for traditional permits is that they do contain all your applicable requirements. The general and registration permits hit on some of the higher items. It may just have some specific thresholds or categories of records that you may need to keep to meet the criteria of those permits, but traditional ones lay out in completion everything that you're going to need to comply with. As I mentioned, there's 2 phases to this program, the construction permit phase and the operation permit phase. In most cases, when we review permits and issue them, the construction permit's issued first and the operation permit sits. That's usually because the construction permit will have many conditions for the facility to demonstrate compliance first. So that construction permit's issued for you to initiate your construction, complete that, have some initial operation, and demonstrate your initial compliance. Once that's achieved, then we can issue that operation permit. However, we do notice, we do our preliminary determination, our draft permits, and noticing of both permits at the same time so that we don't have to go through this public comment period again for the operation permit. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. The other point here, construction permit revision or changes, I'll cover again in just a few seconds, but it's very important to note that it's okay during the construction phase if things change, but we will need to know about those changes during your construction phase as they happen so that we can update that operation permit before it gets issued. If we don't have that communication during that time, it becomes a little difficult when we get to the operation permit phase. Something to note on these traditional permits. You must have your construction permit issued before commencing construction. And I've placed a definition up there for you. You'll note even land clearing is considered commencing construction. We do have a waiver process available. Companies can request to be waived from that requirement so that you can initiate some construction prior to getting your permit. That process, code citations at the bottom, it does have some specific criteria you have to meet. There is an additional fee as well, but that process is available. All right, moving on to the permit process. We get the application in, we do that review. The forms are available online. There's also initial application fee that's required, so when you submit the application, just note that. The application needs to demonstrate how you're going to achieve compliance. One thing to note is to consider how your source is going to be classified. This can play a very important role in rules that apply, agencies that get involved. There's a lot to it. Just go briefly over the different types of classifications that we have. True minor sources are those that, when operating at maximum capacity 24/7, could never reach major source thresholds. Those are our true minor sources. Synthetic minors are those that have the potential, when they operate at maximum capacity, to exceed those major source thresholds, but they elect conditions or want to elect conditions by permit to limit those emissions below that threshold. So they're synthetically made a minor source. SM80s, that's a term that we use with the EPA to classify those that end up getting limited to within 80% of the major source threshold. The difference there gets at whether or not you're going to be inspected. SM80s we do inspect once every 5 years. SMs are not on the slate to be inspected. Then finally, for major sources, two different distinctions there. Part 70, or major Title V source. Typically the threshold there is 100 tons per year, criteria pollutants. Or it can be a major PSD source, as I talked about under 405. That's about 250 tons per year for your criteria pollutants. As I mentioned, your source classification or the size of that project can have an impact on our review. One of the larger impacts is whether or not an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement needs to be completed. Typically for projects that have potential emissions above 100 tons per year, we'll trip the requirement to have an EA. We consider it a type 2 action. An EA process is that which is used to identify whether or not an environmental impact statement needs to be developed. EAs can be very difficult, very time-consuming. It's a multi-program analysis, meaning it won't just be an air issue. We'll bring in every other program. All those environmental issues have to be addressed. And we will be counting on the source to assist with providing a lot of the information in that report. And just so you know, if you have an EA required, we actually cannot make a final determination or issue that permit, the air permit, until the EA is final. So that process can really draw out the timeline on these projects. So we get the application reviewed. During that process, we write what's called a preliminary determination. It's basically a determination on approvability of that project. It includes all the emission calculations and the profile of your source. It discusses all the applicable regulations and goes through ambient air modeling, has that analysis included. I'm going to hit on modeling here for just a little bit. 285 Wisconsin Stats provides that requirement and authority. I wanted to note 285-63-1B, basically in terms, for us to make a determination that it can be approved, we have to demonstrate that your project or source will not violate a national ambient air quality standard. Typically, the best way to go about doing that is through a modeling analysis. However, what's also interesting is under the same statutes, there's actually a statement that our department may not be required to use modeling. Unfortunately, at this time, that's really the best method that we have available, and we still use it. So an air dispersion analysis, or what's known as modeling, all it is an EPA-approved computer model. We put in worst case or allowable emissions into that model as inputs. It's, again, the best reasonable or accepted method to compare your emission profile to the impacts to the ambient air. The other interesting note on this one is most times we do not include fugitive sources in that model. And there's several reasons for that. There can be a lot of assumptions that go into modeling for fugitive sources. The model really likes to look at a point source or emissions coming out of a stack. Those can be easily defined. A fugitive source usually ends up being modeled as an area source, but there's a lot of assumptions that have to go into how that source gets modeled. Based on the assumptions, I could show you to pass and I can show you to fail. So now it just becomes an argument of, did you use the right assumptions? And that's not the argument that we want to go through. However, just to note, we have modeled fugitive sources before. Typically, we only reserve that for major PSD sources, but it can be done. Those results are compared to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Profiles established in your permit, for the most part, on particulate matter. I'll get to this later on a different slide. Some of your emission limitations may be based on those modeled impacts. This is why it's important to have that permit issued prior to commencing your construction. Because you may have a source either get their waiver or ended up constructing before having their permit, and they may end up putting their dryer 100 yards from the property line and 3 silos right next to that. Run the model, and you're blowing away the standards right next to the property line. There may not be a fix other than moving those sources, and we all know you don't want to be going through that. So if you're going to look at getting a waiver from permits, it's strongly suggested you work with your consultants to ensure you run some form of model before you start constructing, to ensure that you can meet these standards. In addition to the preliminary determination, we write a draft permit. Again, this permit outlines all the regulatory requirements that you're going to have to meet. It's broken out by emission units or stacks. I'll be going through that in my third presentation, and it can have multiple parts. The public comment period and hearings. As I mentioned, for traditional permits, there is a requirement for us to hold a 30-day public comment period. The notice is now published by the DNR. We used to have the ability for companies to do the notification for us, and they would receive a credit. We no longer offer that. We do everything online and through the official state paper. For public hearings, you should note that you are, as a facility, able to request that the DNR schedule and hold a hearing. When that's done, we are able to schedule that in line with the public notice and hold that hearing during that same 30-day comment period. What's important about that is, if you don't request a hearing, or we don't anticipate a lot of controversial conversations on this project, and we don't schedule a hearing, days down the road, we may have a request come in from the public to have a hearing. And in most cases, we have to accept that request, grant the request, and hold a hearing. Now, we're talking another couple weeks to get that scheduled and hold it. So that can cause a delay in getting that permit issued. So we get through that review period. The final permit process here is we look at and review all the comments. Typically, a memo is written to discuss the response to those comments and any changes as a result to the draft permit. Something to note is if there are significant changes that may require a re-notice of that permit. For construction permits, I didn't have the right date for operation permits, but for construction permits, we are required to make a final decision within 60 days of the close of that comment period or the hearing, whichever is later. But again, that's only if there's no other environmental actions that have a different date. As I mentioned, the EA. That EA process will trump that statute. So basically, it becomes, we have to issue the permit within so much time, but the EA prevents us from doing that. You won't get that permit until the EA process is complete. I had to throw this up there, denial. No, maybe someone out there is asking or thinking, have we ever denied a permit? Actually, it's been interesting. In my entire career, we have never denied a permit or could find anywhere in our data that we've denied a permit, and then it happened just a year ago or so. We actually did end up denying a permit. Doesn't happen often, but it does. And usually, or in this case, it was because the applicant could not demonstrate compliance with the new source performance standard and did not want to make the changes to the process to meet that standard. We still had to go through the entire review process, notice to the public that we're denying a permit, and then ended up denying the permit. So it does happen. Finally, we're going to talk about single source support facility. We'll look at some definitions, the three-factor determination, what happens when we have a single source of support facility, and then why is this so important? The single source support facility can get very complicated, especially when we're looking at 405, the PSD rules. But basically, those rules rely on a definition of building, structure, facility, or installation, or facility, building, structure, equipment, vehicle, or action. It also relies on how they define a major stationary source and a stationary source. Under 407, it's how a major source is defined. In most cases, these determinations are case by case. You can look through a multitude of EPA memos, white papers, and court case findings. Leave it at that. When you look at some of those decisions, you'll note that there's this three-factor test, as they call it, and that does come from the definition of a major source for the most sense. The first factor is common control. Do we have the same owner or operator? The second factor is belonging to a single major industrial grouping, or the first two-digit SIC code for the two facilities. And are they located on one or more contiguous or adjacent properties? What you need to note is also that support function can be a reasoning for these factors above, or can be a reason on its own. We may not have a single source, we could have a support function, and we'll call them support facilities. The last item here is one of EPA's favorite arguments, is this but-for argument. Basically, in terms of this, if it wasn't for the existence of this area of sand mining within a 4-mile radius, there would be no reason to locate the processing plant at this location here. Using that but-for argument, there's this relationship that EPA can demonstrate exists and may be able to say that some factors in the three-factor test are being satisfied. When we have a single source of support facility, they can have a single permit that covers everything or separate permits. The important part here becomes the aggregation of emissions. When you have a single source or support facility, those emissions must be aggregated, and that has an important implication when we talk about the permit review, because the type of permit relies on your source status, as I covered before. And if your the single source of support facilities end up aggregating to above a PSD threshold, for example, now we're talking about a whole different gambit of regulation and requirements to go through during that permit process. So why is this so important? I just want to note under 439.10 that gives you a brief definition of what circumvention is. Basically, it's the concept of a facility or an owner trying to break up operations or projects into separate projects or operations in order to avoid regulation. That is a big no-no. What can happen is that we get issued what will eventually be called invalid permits or a sham permit. The end result is you will then need to get new permits, potentially new requirements. We then get into the whole issue of looking at ambient air impacts or back determinations under PSD, reconfiguration of your operations or controls, and then of course everyone's favorite, violation or enforcement penalties. So we're here to help you with those determinations. Again, it's not something very easy to do. There are a lot of case-by-case determinations. If you have questions on that, please feel free to get in contact with us, and we'll be happy to assist you with that. And that is it for permits. I have my contact information here. I also put Tom Wolitz. He is our single point of contact for the industrial sand industry. And then a list for compliance engineers. You can go to that website and I'll list out who you can contact for different regions or different areas of our AIR program. And then finally, some references. More information about general permits, contact Joe Brame. He's in our central office. He's our general permit expert. For registration permits, you can contact Kristen Hart, although please note Kristen just recently got promoted. She's now our Permits and Stationary Source Modeling Section Chief. So she may be delayed in getting a response to you. We're still trying to fill her ROP role. But for the time being, please go ahead and give her a call, or you can give me a call. And then several links to the AIR permit website. Before moving on, any questions I can take on permitting?
Just one question. I mean, there's a lot of information goes into these permits. If you're a small operation, you go to a consultant, and there's a lot of consultants out there. You want to talk a little bit about that for the smaller companies, or to make sure that they have the exemption done correctly or cover themselves that way?
Certainly, yeah. For anyone that's looking at building a source that may have emissions, you can always go to a consultant, but feel free to give us a call as well. We always like to have companies come in well ahead of the game to make sure that they get the necessary permits if they need one. For some of the smaller businesses, again, there are a lot of consultants out there available to assist you. As I mentioned, it is very important that if you feel you're exempt, to maintain that proper documentation, and consultants can help you make that determination and also help assist with developing a system or database of all the requirements that you're going to need to meet to continue to be an exempt source. But either way, consultants are getting in touch with us. We can't professionally give you a consultant contact, but there are lists out there. I'm not sure if we still retain one on site or not. I can look into that. We used to have a list of consultants, but yeah, there are many out there that have helped this industry. Any other questions? Okay. All right, the second presentation, we're going to talk about ambient air quality standards, or the monitoring. I'll note there are some duplicative slides in here, but they're very important, so that's the reason why. For this presentation, we're going to look at what are the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, how are they established, the regulations for the NAAQS, implementing those regulations, and demonstrating compliance via monitoring. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards are standards set by the federal EPA. There are two sets of standards, the primary standards and the secondary. Primary standards are those set to protect public health, and they focus on ensuring the protection of the most sensitive individuals, so the elderly, children, and asthmatics. Basically, the concept is protecting the most susceptible, means you will be protecting the rest of the population. Secondary standards get at protecting public welfare, the decreased visibility, damage to animals, crops, vegetation, and buildings. Standards are set for your criteria pollutants. And if you're having trouble sleeping at night, take a look at the historical development of these standards. It's really great reading. But what is neat is that you should note these standards are reviewed periodically. EPA is required, usually on a 3 or 5 year cycle, to look at the science behind how these standards have been set, the technology available today versus how it was 3 or 5 years ago. And through that process, these standards can get updated. As you may know, we are looking at getting a different, I believe it's a 2.5 standard soon. Wisconsin adopts these standards under our state implementation plan. We have adopted them as is, although we do have the ability to create a more stringent standard if we so feel it's important to do so. However, it's never happened in my experience. I doubt it will ever happen. There's a huge process you have to go through to set your own standard. Again, hitting on 285, that's where it contains the requirements for the ambient air quality standards. And as I mentioned, on the modeling side, or a permit approval process, we need to be able to demonstrate that your project will attain the standards. And that becomes important in just a second. The actual regulations are contained under Chapter NR 404. That's where you can actually see the concentration threshold, the time average for each of the standards. I have the slide up here again because, as I mentioned, we need to be able to demonstrate that your facility can attain the standards. And the best way to do that, or the most acceptable at this time, is through modeling. The whole issue of the fugitive sources not being included in most cases provides a basis, as I'll get to, on why we see a lot of monitoring requirements. For monitoring, there's very few regulations that actually specify a requirement to monitor. We do find one for this industry under 415. 415 is our particulate matter chapter. It does specify the need to perform ambient air monitoring. I'll note that under 285-65, there's also authorities there for us to specify requirements in your permit necessary to assure compliance with 285-63. And if you remember going back, 285-63 is that criteria for permit approval, basically that statement of, can we assure that you're meeting the ambient air quality standards, that you won't be in violation of that? So there's some authority there for us to also establish other requirements in the permit to ensure that attainment's going to occur by complying with that permit. 404 does contain the general methods for conducting that monitoring. So the relationship between your permit requirements and the limits. The permit that you'll have, again, this is going to the traditional permits, contain your most restrictive limit. And those can come from any regulation under NR 400, the Wisconsin code, or a federal standard. The interesting part for particulate matter is that in most cases we've seen lately for permits, 404, the ambient air quality standards, ends up being the most restrictive when establishing limits. This is certainly the case for PM10 and PM2.5 because a lot of regulations actually don't specify those fractions of particulate matter. They usually only talk about PM. So 404 usually ends up becoming that limiting factor for establishing the limits. Those limits in your permit usually represent your worst case impact. Facilities like to be able to emit the most that they can while still attaining compliance, and that's how most of the permits are written, although some take further restrictive limitations. So because those limits are, or those that mission profile has been modeled and showed attainment, basically then complying with your permit means you're complying with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. I had to throw this up there before moving on into the monitoring section. Some important distinctions to remember here. When we issue a permit, that does not mean we're protecting the environment. It's all about the source complying with the permit. Compliance with that issued permit ends up resulting in the environment being protected. Number two, I hit on this under the permit presentation. Being exempt from a permit does not exempt you from the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. Those NAAQS, quote, apply to the entire state without exception. So on to the monitoring. It is the only true method of providing actual measurable impact of sources on the ambient air. However, it is not the definitive red light when exceedances are found. I'll touch on that in just a little bit. But there are certain things that we would like to see done when monitoring is going to be conducted, and one of them is to establish what the background concentrations are in the area prior to your source constructing and operating. That will help with the analysis of that data once you have been operating. Having that background will help with determining when we get any sort of high readings or exceedances, what was already in the area before you came in. For monitoring for PM, we used to have in our code a PM standard, or what was referred to total suspended particulate, TSP standard. It was a secondary standard that had been dropped by EPA many years ago, and Wisconsin finally dropped it just a couple years ago. All we're left with today are standards for PM10 and PM2.5. As you may know, PM or TSP is particulate of 100 microns or less. Technical terms like 100 micrometers of aerodynamic diameter or less. PM10 is 10 microns or less, 2.5 is 2.5 microns or less. So PM10 and 2.5 are subsets of PM. However, because there is no standard anymore for particulate matter, there's really no good reason to monitor for it. You'll have nothing to compare it against. So for 415.075, it talks about particulate matter monitoring system. We would want to look at monitoring for something other than PM because, again, there's no standard for PM to measure against, where there is for PM10 and PM2.5. And we would like to work with you as you develop those plans describing that monitoring system to incorporate something that gets to PM10 or 2.5, something that's more meaningful. These next few slides were developed by Jason Troidel. Some of you may know him. He is our monitoring specialist down in Madison, our coordinator. I'm sure I won't do these justice, but I have his contact information at the end. This is all about the actual monitoring. For monitoring plans, please understand that you have to have these written and approved before your monitoring begins. And you may certainly work with our monitoring coordinator, that is Jason Troidel, and getting that completed. The monitoring site or locations, they can be selected based on the predictive maximum concentration that comes through that model, the ambient air analysis. We may want to locate it at where that model predicts to have the biggest impact. In a lot of cases, we've actually worked with the companies to site it in areas that are influenced by the predictive maximum impact. Meaning, if you have farm fields to the north and the east, but residents, retirement homes, whatever, to the south and west, we may actually want to put that monitor into the south or west areas where you might have the higher impact to public health. Those sites typically require a site visit by the DNR, and we'll be more than happy to come up and site those with you. And forms have to be completed to register that site with the EPA air quality system. And that's where an ID gets assigned and it gets tracked. For the equipment, The operations must meet Federal Reference Method, FRM, or Federal Equivalent Method, FEM. For PM10, you're usually looking at a high volume sampler. For PM2.5, it's a low volume. You can also use, with the approval, a low volume PM10, a dichromatous samplers, continuous analyzers, or other methods. For operating the monitors, there's a set schedule. EPA has a 1 in 6 or a 1 in 3. Typically, I see the 1 in 6. Basically, that ensures that you hit at least one every day of the week. You'll need to conduct flow and other checks monthly and perform other preventative maintenance. We would also like to come up and perform an audit on that system, typically soon after startup. For the reporting, monthly data reports have to be submitted by the following month. So for example, February data has to be submitted by March 31st. You do need to include a lot of that maintenance or information on the system, such as the calibration and flow check information, any sort of data validity issues. And while not required, it's certainly very helpful if you have any other ancillary information, lab reports, for example. Those can always be included. This starts to get out of my expertise on monitoring, but I have it included anyways. For PM2.5 or PM10, you should note that PM2.5 monitoring has to be done in actual conditions or reported in actual conditions, whereas PM10 is reported in standard conditions. So you want to make sure as you develop your data that it ends up being reported as required. The operational flow rates have to be maintained in actual terms to maintain correct particle cut size. There is this correction factor that can be used. You'll need to talk with Jason why that's important. I'm sorry, I don't really know why that is, but it does come up for PM10 samplers. So we have a monitor at the site. It's been operating. What happens when there's an exceedance found? As I mentioned, there's not this red light, stop everything. There's something wrong. That's not usually the case. There's a lot of analysis that has to go into looking at why an exceedance was found. First and foremost, we want to look at the sources that are culpable. Was it something actually at the sand mine or processing plant source? Were there other potential sources in the area that contributed? Perhaps there was a natural event. Forest fires out in California, believe it or not, we do pick that up on our monitoring network here in Wisconsin within a day or a couple days. We see those impacts. So again, seeing an exceedance on a monitor is not always going to mean there's something going on at the facility. Weather, unusual events can contribute. Usually, what we may find, we get these complaints, or you have a high impact at a location. For the source itself, we can usually tie that to some form of malfunction, some process upset. Your bag house bags broke, and you're spewing out all the dust. It just happened to blow right to that monitor, right? That's usually the case that we'll find that something occurred that's known. On enforcement, getting to that, typically you won't see enforcement on the violation of an ambient standard, because again, there's a lot of analysis that has to go into that determination. It would rather get towards those areas where there was a source failure. Okay, a malfunction that was not dealt with according to their plan, a process that hadn't been stack tested yet and was emitting 5 times as much as it was supposed to be. And there's usually some other area of concern that we'll hit on besides the actual monitored exceedance. did want to talk just briefly about this whole concept of PM4. PM4 and crystalline silica, I should say. With the rise of this industry, crystalline silica has become a huge issue. Public constituents are very well aware of the hazards of this substance, and I wanted to share some of the information that we have currently. But this whole thing of PM4 crystalline silica, there is no standard or regulation of PM4 or crystalline silica by the state or federal agency. PM4 is something directly related to crystalline silica. It's basically that size fraction in the studies that have been done that shows where the size of concern for the crystalline silica has a health impact. Basically at PM4 size, that 4 micron size, is the size of crystalline silica when it gets into the lungs can cause the most damage. So that's why we've termed it PM4 as we talk about it. Unfortunately, there is no approved or accepted monitoring methodology for PM4 or crystalline silica at that size fraction. So when we talk about monitoring at sites, people may ask, why can't we monitor for crystalline silica at PM4? Well, again, there's no approved method for it. You can certainly do it. There are ways to get alternate methods approved, but at this point, there's nothing that's been accepted. You can always entertain the idea that if we monitor for PM2.5, we just assume worst case, or PM4, I'm sorry, that perhaps everything monitored at PM4 is equivalent for PM2.5. So there's an entertainment of that with the industry. Getting on to mentioning for the current studies ongoing, we actually do have several sources, I shouldn't say we, sorry. There are several sources that have been conducting some monitoring like this for PM4 and crystalline silica. EOG Resources in Chippewa County have hired an outside consultant to do this elaborate study on PM4 impacts around mines and the processing plant. They will be doing sampling of the collected catch to look at the substances, the crystalline silica fraction. FG Fairmount Badger Mining, they are also doing a similar study at some of their sites. This is, again, nothing that's required by the DNR. That's something that they have taken on themselves and have been willing to share information with us. Some things that I want to hit on here that we should note. If you read through a lot of the science out there, it can get a little bit confusing. Other states do have standards for crystalline silica, ambient standards, something for permit thresholds in their states. We've done a crystalline silica study. We've made a report on that. It's available online. The interesting takeaway from that is in a lot of those states that do have a standard set, they have nothing further required that we don't already require for the control of particulate matter. What I'm saying is, if the state of Wisconsin were to adopt a standard for crystalline silica, would the companies have to do anything different? And the answer is most likely not. The types of control methods that they utilize today are very similar to what's required in states that do have a standard. The other interesting note is, well, why isn't there a standard already, or why hasn't there been one adapted? And that can get to so many factors. Crystalline silica is a naturally occurring element. It's everywhere. Interesting to look at some of the reports on sources. You actually find agricultural sources and roadways being the major culpable source for crystalline silica. Sand mines actually represent less than 5%, I believe it is. Believe it or not. What's interesting on this industry, the frac sand industry, the size of the sand that they're most interested in is PM70 or greater. They don't want the fine material. And a lot of the times where you have the wet processing plants located at the mine or at the processing plant itself, They wash out all those fines. They don't want them. Usually the end result is they return them back into the mine for reclamation. They want the larger size grains of sand. PM70 is about the smallest that this industry is usually looking at. On crystalline silica, yes, about 90+% of the sand is silica-based quartz. The sand that they're looking at is the very roundish, spherical, high tensile strength crystalline silica or quartz. You think about what they're using this for, it's for being injected into these wells deep under the earth under high, immense pressures. They don't want this sand to break. It needs to meet specifications that means it retains its shape. It won't fracture. In their processing, they aren't fracturing the sand. They're mining the sand, washing it, drying it, screening it, and sending it out. There is no fracturing being done of this sand. When we talk about workplace exposure, where there are standards for crystalline silica, that's about some of these other forms of processes that you can think about that utilize sand, sandblasting, foundry sand. They don't care so much as the spherical shape of their sand when you're blasting paint off a metal piece. But in sandblasting, you have that workplace exposure because that sand is being blasted on a metal part. It's fragmented, it's shattered. In those cases, you are fracturing the sand into smaller pieces, and that's why they have those standards for workplace exposure. They have that data, that studies, information there, and why they have the risk associated with dealing with fractured crystalline silica. We don't see that so much from this industry because, again, they're not fracturing the sand. They're not creating the freshly fractured faces of the crystalline silica that's so hazardous and reactive. Getting to EOG's and FG's studies, it's going to be some time yet before we get all the information, but we're very excited to see that. I believe it just got started for EOG. It's been going on for a couple months, but it's going to be at least a year or more yet before we get a final report, but we're very anxious to see what the results show. Finally, on the contacts, again, I have myself. Please contact Jason Treudel if you have questions on monitoring. He's very helpful. Tom Olitz, as well as our single point of contact or your compliance engineers.
Jeff, as you're booting up, are you done with this program?
I am.
I just want to tell you that EOG, this is a really good study that you're doing. It's really good sharing the data, sharing it with us. They didn't want a whole bunch of press contacts, public contacts, media contacts, so they asked me to be kind of their.
You get on the mic so they can hear you on the tape.
You want me to repeat that?
Right there. We got you.
Yeah, EOG has been very sharing with their data, with their study. It's a really good study. I think it's going to provide good results. They didn't want to have people come in and ask them about the study, a lot of media or public contact, so they asked me to be the contact. I do have all the protocols for the 3 mines that they're monitoring at, as well as their processing facility, and also have the first preliminary report. So if anybody wants that, just contact me and I can easily email it to you. And the first quarter results came in, and they really didn't show anything of significance. The upwind monitors and the downwind monitors both were about the same. They showed what we would expect as a background concentration. As Jeff said, there's lots of other sources of respirable crystalline silica out there, and they're showing 1 to 2 micrograms per cubic meter in that range, which is natural background. So, I mean, it's everywhere. That last breath that you all took in here right now, you all breathe respirable crystalline silica because it's in the air right now. And the other point I want to make is there's a rumor going around, and it's taking up some traction. I don't know if it's on the internet, that 100% of Wisconsin's industrial sand mines are violating the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for particulates, and that is absolutely not true. all the monitoring data that we have seen from the mines, our monitors are 2.5 monitors that we have up by the State Patrol. None of them have exceeded any of the national ambient air quality standards. But if you hear that, it's out there. I've got contacts from Minnesota Pollution Control Agency that they're hearing that too. People are showing up at hearings and making that claim. It's not true.
Thanks, Tom. Any questions?
Is ambient air monitoring becoming part of, is that a requirement that the DNR is placing on all permits now on sand mining, or is it just some of them? And if you have been requiring them, what kind of results are you seeing? Is it pretty much similar to what this gentleman just talked about with DOG, or what are you guys seeing?
Ambient air monitoring, it is a requirement under the Wisconsin code, under 415, I mentioned that. There is a bit availability for requesting a variance from that monitoring. We have, in both cases, approved and denied variances. So in some situations, facilities are monitoring by requirement by our program. Others have been approved to not monitor by variance. Some companies have elected to monitor on their own. For the monitoring that's being done so far, we've worked with them to establish PM10 monitors. At this point, none of them, again, as Tom mentioned, have shown any exceedance of the standard. We're seeing, I want to say, impacts well below 30 micrograms per cubic meter. The standard's 150. Thanks for bringing that up. One other interesting point is the actual impacts we're looking at or seeing on the data are actually below the 2.5 standard. If you were to consider worst case, all the PM10 collected as PM 2.5, we could also demonstrate these sources attaining 2.5 standard. Does that answer your question? Any other questions?
It sounds like with all the testing, going on that you've got, we're seeing some of the counties and some of the municipalities that are concerned with the general health, safety, and welfare of the residents. Jeff, is your opinion, based on the testing results that you've got, that DNR is really satisfying the general health and welfare of the residents in the area?
Yeah, I would say by the permits have been issued and the level of compliance seen, obviously complying with that permit, again, protects the environment, gets back to those standards that are set to protect public health. Companies that are in compliance with that permit, we can say, is being protective of public health. The difficult part does get to that fugitive emission issue. Because we don't model it, it's not included, it's not known how that could be impacting the environment. But at least through the monitoring that's being conducted, it's conclusive at least that by companies that follow their plans accordingly are likely to then be in attainment of those standards and would be protecting public health. Any other questions? All right, I got you for one more presentation and I'll be out of your hair. This is the fun part, complying with your permit. I'm going to take a look at the permit structure, again, focusing on your traditional permits. We'll take a look at some of the different methods of complying or demonstrating compliance, stack testing, your control device operations, CEM, PEMs, practices and plans. Talk a little bit about record keeping and reporting, and then highlighting here again this transition period between construction and operation permits. For the permit structure, there's the preamble. Sometimes you won't see these in construction permits. They're more meant for the operation permits. but it just lists out the historical record of your permit activity, the sources that are significant and sources that are insignificant, any sort of rules that have been reviewed, regulations that have been reviewed and determined to not apply. That's all contained in that preamble. Part 1, I'll focus on for the rest of this presentation, or at least the permit. It is facility specific. The Part 1 is written just for you. It will likely be different from other sources. Part 2 applies to everyone. It's the exact same Part 2 for everybody. But they're usually just general conditions that apply to everybody. Parts 3, 4, etc., they may be added on for other reasons. Typically for this industry, we don't see them. For example, they could contain a green tier contract language, something more unique. So this is an example of a permit in landscape format. Read this left to right. The first column there identifies your pollutant, particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, you name it. Second column will include your limitations. In most cases, for new permits we've been writing today, we will include all applicable limitations rather than just the most stringent, because sometimes what we have determined to be the most stringent may not be, depending on the operation of your source. So you could see a pound per hour limitation, a pound per input basis, whether that's heat input, material input basis, or it could be a pound per exhaust rate. So you might end up seeing multiple limitations that could be the most stringent depending on how you're operating the source at the time. Third column here will get at your compliance demonstration methods. This is the column that tells you how you are going to demonstrate compliance with those limits. The fourth represents your record keeping, monitoring requirements. I'll point out this monitoring is not the same as the ambient monitoring we just discussed. It's about monitoring your control device. Okay. Compliance demonstrations, the different types of methods. We'll talk about stack testing first. As I mentioned, there's this two-phase to your permit process, the construction permit phase and the operation permit phase. In most cases, the construction permit's issued first and operation permit waits because there's some initial form of compliance that has to be demonstrated. Typically that is in the form of a stack test. There's, during that initial demonstration under your construction permit, you demonstrate the initial compliance. Once that's done and we issue the operation permit, there may then be continuous demonstration by stack testing under your operation permit. Usually we don't find that for minor sources. So in most cases for the sand mines or processing plants, you won't see that ongoing or repetitive stack testing being required. The rules do have biennial testing required for major sources, okay, but not for minor. The requirement can come from a specific regulation, and if not, 439 does contain the ability or authorities for us to require a stack test whenever. So even though it may not be in your permit, be aware that we can always request that you conduct a stack test at any time. Control devices. In your compliance demonstration, you will have methods on how to properly operate that control device. Typically, there's some form of monitoring associated with that device. So for an example, a bag house. We'll look at monitoring the pressure drop. Now, pressure drop really doesn't tie in or have a relationship to an actual emission rate. The purpose is to ensure that that control device is properly operating. Usually with these control devices, the manufacturer will have specifications that say when a unit is operating within these specifications, you are likely to see this range of guaranteed emissions. And so we look at establishing those types of operational parameters to be monitored on a regular basis. For control devices, you can also specify different ways to ensure that it's operating properly under a malfunction prevention abatement plan. I'll talk about plans in a little bit as well. For the control devices, the requirements or authorities under 439 could be a specific regulation, and 439.11 talks about the malfunction plan. CEMs and PEMs. These are the most near direct measurement of a pollutant in an exhaust stream. Okay, continuous emission monitor is some form of a probe in the stack that can measure that pollutant. CO, NOx, opacity. There are performance specifications for those. They have to be met, QA, QC. A lot goes into operating these CEMs to ensure that they're operating properly. Routine audits, RADA testing. CEMs can be required by specific regulation or under 439. Typically for this industry, we don't see CEMs, although they're in one category, there is an option to have a CEM for opacity versus having a visible emission observer on site. Pollution prevention practices or plans. The most common one for this industry is the fugitive dust plan. I will note, if you read the code, 41504 is the general fugitive dust. It applies to everybody. That code does not specify the requirement for a plan. But when you look at what's required for fugitive dust prevention, it talks about taking precautions to prevent. It's typically best for sources to develop a plan that lists out what those precautions are. 415075 does specify the requirement for a plan. However, under either one, they're not prescriptive by rule. 04 talks about precautions shall include but not limited to. 415075 says, or as other information needed by the department. So they're open-ended. For this industry, we've actually developed a template plan to get you started. We have currently been requesting these plans at the time of application. Usually we've been requiring them after issuance of a construction permit, within so many days of issuance. But with the waivers being initiated and a lot of interest in fugitive dust, we've actually have sources now work on these plans at the front end of the stage, the application stage. But there, again, there's that template available online. Take a look at it. It can help guide you on what we're looking for. For fugitive dust plans, I do want to note for the intro on 415004, no person may cause, allow, or permit any materials to be handled, transported, or stored without taking precautions to prevent particulate from becoming airborne. This is not a reactive standard. This is a proactive one. Plans that come in and say, when we see dust, we'll water. No. It's a proactive measurement. We will water when we anticipate winds picking up above 10 miles an hour. We'll just water daily. Some form of prevention that gets at trying to prevent the dust from occurring in the first place. Now, does this mean there won't be dust? No, we understand. Things are going to dry out. No matter how much you water, there's going to be dust blowing around. We're not expecting zero dust, so long as you are following that plan to prevent the dust. Finally, some other types of plans. I mentioned the malfunction prevention abatement plan. This can be a very important one. It talks about what you as a facility will do in the event of a malfunction. And this can get at both an operational unit or a control device. So you don't have to have a control device to be subject to an MPAP. Applies to every operation. It can detail out what you're going to do in the occurrence, again, of some form of malfunction. For the example, a bag breaks on the bag house. The facility's going to shut down the unit within an hour, change the bag, start it back up. In cases where facilities are able to follow that plan, can alleviate issues of non-compliance and enforcement. Another form is a startup shutdown malfunction plan. That one's more common under a federal MAC standard. Might not usually see those in these types of permits that we have for this industry, but it is another example. Everyone's favorite, record keeping. This is the primary method of demonstrating your compliance. I cannot stress how important this is for your compliance. It is the major portion of our review as an inspector if we were ever to come out and do an inspection. I would say 75% or more of the time that we spend at companies during an inspection or some form of compliance evaluation, it's all about reviewing the records. Those records are, again, specified in your permit, as that last column. But please also note there may be additional requirements under Part 2. I've seen a lot of companies focus in on Part 1 and forget about Part 2. That's just as important. The record keeping can be specified by a certain regulation or can be something created under this general citation under 439. Record keeping can include records of all your sampling, testing, monitoring conducted or required under the chapter or under an air pollution control permit. It can be any other records related to the emission of air contaminants which may be requested by the department. You should retain your records for at least 5 years, but note that doesn't mean they always have to be on site. Typically it's a 2-year time frame that they should be retained on site. Everything else can be retained off site, your headquarters, for example. Also note that records don't have to be on paper. They can be in a database, some other form, just so long as they are readily accessible when requested by the department. Keep in mind your due dates. Example, you have a requirement to measure your tons per month of sand export or production. You may be required to generate that data within 30 days of the end of the previous month. I wanted to highlight this one because it's more common to see a violation on this one where, in the general sense, someone can fail to keep the records. They don't have the tons per day of processing. That's the most basic form. More complex is how that data is then used to show compliance with some other condition. So for example, this 12-month average. A facility could have their tons per day data all spread out in their spreadsheet. They're tracking it. Yep, we got it. And we go in and I say, show me your 12-month average calculation for March of 2013. You say, well, we didn't do that calculation. That's also a violation. So make sure that you're not just collecting data, that you're also assessing and analyzing that data for any sort of required calculation, some other form of record. Reporting, this is specified by your permit, but do pay attention to Part 2, Section D. Reporting can be specified by a regulation or something created under 439. In the most case, this even goes for general and registration permits. The primary reporting requirements include your annual, semi-annual monitoring reports. Please note that this is not the same as a compliance certification. They're two different things. Although I believe for the ROPS and GOPS, they may have combined them recently. But for your traditional permits and sources, those are different. The annual, semi-annual monitoring reports get at, for example, your pressure drop readings on the baghouse. That's part of that monitoring report. Okay, the second layer of compliance certification is a little bit different. It talks about certifying that your source has been in compliance year-round for the calendar year. Please be aware, it's okay to be in intermittent compliance. If you had a pressure drop reading outside of the range, that's not being in full compliance year-round. That's okay. Mark intermittent compliance and attach the deviation report. The third one there is the annual emission inventory, everyone's favorite. Comes year-round, actually. You guys should have been just completing that a couple days ago. Other reporting requirements. Again, you usually won't see these in the part 1 of your permit, but certainly under part 2. These are very important. You should know that you actually need to notify us, usually sometimes within a 24-hour period or 48 hours after the occurrence, malfunctions or unscheduled events, exceedances or deviations. These are all types of things that need to be reported to us. A shutdown, breakdown, malfunction of a monitoring device, or a planned shutdown when you want to continue operating where you are supposed to be operating with a control device. Okay, but the first two there are really important. We'd rather hear from you right away than be getting calls from a lot of frantic public that are wondering, why is there black smoke coming out of this person's stack? Okay, if we get to hear from you first, we'll be able to tell the public what's going on and that we're working with you to resolve the issue. Finally, please note that there may be times where we need some information. It's not your typical reporting period, but we have some questions for you. We can submit what we'll call a letter of information request, LOI, just to ask for some information, and the authority comes under 439, allows us to ask you for that. Last topic, but very important one, transitioning. Again, there's the construction permit phase and the operation permit phase. In most cases, because the construction permit's issued first, there's a portion of that permit that talks about how to transition from construction to operation. During your construction phase, there are several notifications that you need to submit. Your initial construction modification dates, your initial operation dates. Believe it or not, these are important. Some regulations are applicable based on a date of construction. They can be based on a date of operation. These dates are very important, and we need to know those. Submittal of your compliance testing information and other updates. So we need to know if you have changed your process from the initial application that we approved the permit for. It's okay. It's so common to have sources construct slightly different from how they originally applied. It happens. We understand that. But it's your obligation to notify us of those changes immediately. So as you go through that construction phase, we can update that application and ensure any of those changes don't end up violating some other standard. Okay? That gets to that whole construction permit revision. So if we need to make some changes, we can revise that construction permit timely before it expires. Okay, that's the time to take care of those changes, not after it's expired or under the operation permit. Stack test results or maybe some other information that we're looking for. Why this is so important? Getting that information into us will allow the continued operation beyond the expiration of your permit, but only if you've satisfied those notification or updates submittals. Okay? In the case where we're not able to get your operation permit issued timely, so long as you've met that, all you need to do is to continue to comply with your current permit or changes as applied until that new operation permit's issued. So there's this shield available. but you have to meet those requirements. Contacts again, for those that have permits, have questions, do get in touch with your compliance engineer. If you don't know who that is, there's a list there, or give me a call. Any questions? Okay.
If there aren't any questions, thanks, Jeff. Excellent presentation. I know that you need to leave shortly here, so, the DNR staff, taking the time out today to come here to provide this valuable information to us should be applauded. So let's give Jeff a round of applause.